what do you think causes stiffness?
When we think of muscles, we think of output organs, things that do stuff. Muscles are our primary sensory organ. We zoom in and we go, oh man, this lacrosse ball. It's like that person might even have a visual disturbance. Maybe if we put that person in front of a mirror and they could actually see themselves, they could improve their mobility.
What does a mirror do? It's just giving that feedback?
Yeah. You can start to see, oh, I know where I am, so I know where I need to go.
Have you seen cold therapy be of benefit to some people?
See, yeah, I find that really interesting. So yes.
Something like red light, where does that fall into this scheme of things?
Test and retest. Hey, my mobility is better after I do red light. Amazing. Are you good at it? Yes. Well, you probably are missing an opportunity where you could be really using that time better leverage in somewhere that might actually improve other aspects of your recovery that you're not paying attention to.
All hell breaks loose.
Yeah. Oh God. Still waiting for my steroid thing to turn into a heroin addiction, but that's been like a decade. So I think we're good on that front.
It might morph still. You got to be cautious.
If I want to lose weight, I feel like that would be probably less side effects than DNP or the same side effects as DNP.
I got a question for you here. You're a doctor, so
oh boy,
I'm hoping that you got some answers here.
Can't wait to disappoint you.
What do you think causes someone to be tight? And what do you think causes stiffness in the body? Like maybe, for most people, I think when they wake up first thing in the morning, their body's kind of tighter than it maybe was when they were exercising the day before. So where does some stiffness come from? And then where does like someone's body just deciding that it's going to be like much tighter than somebody else's body?
These are multifactorial issues. So, something like metabolism, nutrition, hydration, all of those things could definitely play a role as it enters into like the physical preparedness space, muscular tightness, as so far as it's a limiting factor to exercise. It's essentially mediated system at the level of what's called the cerebellum. So cerebellum, if you look at like the lobes of your brain, so kind of like breaking away from a normal paradigm of like, oh, a muscle is like short, therefore it's tight, right? We think of this as very mechanical, two-dimensional system. I sit all day, my hip flexors are short, therefore X, Y, and Z, where it's like your body's just complicated. And it's almost as if when we look to approach the body, it was the same way we look at approach the phone, like a cell phone. We all put our iPhones right now. We know how to use applications and download applications and all that. But when the phone breaks, you realize that you have no fucking idea how the phone works. And then you go to, we go to an engineer, you go to Apple. A genius. Yes, aptly named, I'm sure. Well, they know more about it. But the guys who actually like are, manipulating the software, writing the software, it could, whatever. Even at the hardware level, it's complicated. And the body's a lot like that, where there's a reductionistic model that lets us be very comfortable operating the apps every day. But it's like, when we ask a question like that, it's like, okay, what happens when there's a bug in this software? It's like, well, fuck, that's like a bit of a loaded question. So the technical answer is there's a region in your brain called the cerebellum. It's your movement brain. And so to kind of, to landscape the brain a little bit, you sort of have like these like four lobes of the brain. You have like your frontal lobe, your temporal lobe, your parietal lobe, your occipital lobe, which kind of makes up the brain. If you're like thinking in your head about like a comic book brain sitting in a vat somewhere, those are the four things that you're probably thinking of. And then there's a brain stem, so midbrain pons and medulla. If you think of medulla, you're probably thinking about Waterboy, the medulla oblongata. So right off of
you can find a brain for us there, Andrew.
Yeah, that also works too. And then so the cerebellum is just off of the brainstem, underneath like the cerebrum, underneath these four lobes. And this part of the brain is what it mediates a lot of things like rhythm, coordination, timing. And one of the things it mediates is super interesting is for this conversation is tone. Now, tone we might think is like a desired training outcome that's kind of misunderstood. Like you want to be a little bit less fat and you want to have a little bit more muscle. But tone has like another definition in like the clinical setting of like how stiff you are. Are you on high tone or low tone would kind of be a way we would say someone who like muscles feel like this, they're on relatively high tone. So there you go. You have a couple additional structures in what we were talking about. There's like a hippocampus and an amygdala in there and postcentral gyrus. But what you're looking at the bottom, sort of that, they say it's a walnut-shaped projection off of the back of the pons in the midbrain, the cerebellum there. I've never eaten a walnut that looks like that. I probably wouldn't if I saw one. But that's the cerebellum. So the cerebellum has three components to it. Now, we are very visual creatures by design, right? So if you have a dog? You have a dog.
Yep.
It was that really small white thing that was in the, somehow that scared the shit out of me when your wife was here earlier. I was walking by, I'm like, and I was just like, yeah. And well, like, I love dogs, but dogs are not visual creatures, right? They don't map their environment with their vision. They map it with their sense of smell. They're very olfaction driven, right? But if you think about human beings, and we're very much visual creatures, our visual acuity is probably one of the higher, when it comes to apex predators, one of the better, ocular systems that we have, or optic systems that we have. Peregrine falcons, snow owls, things like that probably might be a little bit better, but some animals can't see shit at all.
Like a moose.
Like a moose, exactly. Yeah. But it's like, so they're running off of different systems. Now, this could be the entire episode, but I think it's a really useful conversation to at least attempt to understand, because like the human body is very complicated and it's under no obligation to make sense to anyone, right? As long as you're cool playing the apps on the phone, that's fine. But like, if you want to start fixing things, you got to know the inner workings of it. So that cerebellum really breaks down into 3 functional subsections. So there's a spinocerebellar tract, a cerebrocerebellar tract, and a vestibulocerebellar tract. Now, I'm going to glaze over 2 pretty quickly and get to the one that most often highlights the interventions we use to help improve mobility.
I think you're talented, by the way, just so you know.
Thank you. Yeah. I appreciate that. I can't fly drones or edit videos, but I can talk about neuroanatomy.
You tried to say that you weren't earlier, but I think you're talented.
Thank you. I appreciate it. That's going to go on my LinkedIn profile later. Mark Bell thinks I'm talented.
I love it.
So the 3 functional subcomponents of the cerebellum are the vestibulocerebellum, the spinocerebellum, and the cerebrocerebellum. So the cerebrocerebellum basically talks about how your body maps the external environment through motor patterns. So if we think about the cerebrum, which if we're looking at this image, is basically everything above the brainstem and the cerebellum. So all of the pink stuff, the blue stuff, and the green stuff, for those of you following along at home. We have a part in our brain, it's called pre and primary motor cortex, where we hold motor patterns, right? So a motor pattern, I think of like a zip folder, right? So when my media guy tells me something and it's like, I'm going to send you a folder, and it's the file is a bajillion, trillion gigabytes. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like, I don't know what that means. And it comes in this thing, it's a zip folder. And so I got to click it, and then it unzips, and then I have this massive folder that was sent through the interwebs. I can't say internet around you. And so that is a motor pattern. Now, for someone who is an athlete who's done something a bunch of times, they have these things that they can do with their eyes closed because they've done them so many times. These exist in this cerebrocerebellar tract. So we have another tract, the vestibulocerebellar system, which uses the inputs from our eyes and our vestibular system, this thing in our inner ear, that our balance center. So if you like spin around a bunch of times, you feel dizzy. That feeds into the cerebellum the same as the cerebrocerebellar. So we're getting like real-time footage of what's going on in front of us. We have this calibration tool of like this altimeter, this movement gyroscope in our head mixed with what we're seeing. That's one message into this system. So we have a message into our system of what we've done before. We have a message in our system of what we're doing right now. And then we have a peripheral system, which is gathering a ton of information from where our body is in space. That's the spinocerebellar tract, right? And so between these 3 tracts, what the cerebellum does is, we can think of it a little bit like this room. If this room was the body and we wanted to illuminate all corners of this room and do it in a way that's as energy efficient as possible, right? We wouldn't use like the ridiculous studio lights we have here. These are serving a different purpose. Like if you've ever been in a place where the power has been cut off, but there are backup emergency lights that are super, super bright. Those lights' purpose is to illuminate every square inch of that room with as little actual source light as possible, but they're super inefficient. There's a reason you don't run the emergency lights all day. We kind of put these like whatever halogen, LCD, tube lights, fluorescent lights all over that kind of illuminate. If we wanted to do it really effectively, a handful of candles strategically placed in here would give us enough visual information that we could navigate this room with confidence, right? If this room was completely dark, we wouldn't know where to go. We would walk very slowly. I'd be like, oh, we'd all just sort of be doing this, trying to gain some insight about our external environment through other means that's not our primary way of mapping, which is visual, right? So if we think about the cerebellum as like a dimmer switch, and that could go between candles in the corner of every part of the room, illuminating the room, to emergency lights on the ceiling. The best, most efficient way to do it is to have these candles sort of all over the room. And this is where the spinocerebellar tract comes in. So if we think about I think of motion capture to make this analogy. So if we think of like Gollum from Lord of the Rings, or making a character on a video game or an athlete into a video game, we're going to take them to a motion capture studio. We're going to put this like Lycra suit on them with a bunch of little polka dots all over them. Those polka dots are transmitters, and then the central processor is the receiver. So what you're doing is you're getting this real-time information about where adjacent structures are in space as you move. That's why like Andy Serkis, the actor that played Gollum in Lord of the Rings, can go on the sound stage somewhere in Orlando somewhere and make it look like he's in Middle Earth. Right? We paint this on. The spinocerebellar tract is that. Now this is where a lot of like more popular nomenclature, more common verbiage might come into play. Mechanoreceptors and proprioreceptors. Proprioception is a word that gets thrown around a lot, but oftentimes misunderstood. So when we look at the spinocerebellar tract, so just to kind of bring everyone back up to speed really quickly, we have the cerebrum of the brain, the 4 lobes of the brain, the 3 parts of the brainstem, and the cerebellum. Our conversation today is about the cerebellum and how it interacts to create an internal motion capture system. It acts as a dimmer switch. The whole point is to know where the body is in space. That's what makes it sort of like our movement brain. It needs to know where we are before we know where we're going. Kind of a profound statement if you think about it. You need to be able to map your internal environment. So the cerebellum has 3 functional subsystems. This is literally for the purpose of people taking notes. And this might be a little bit academically constipated, but bear with me because it's super useful to understand this. Your cerebellum breaks down to 3 functional subcomponents of your vestibulocerebellum, your cerebrocerebellum, and your spinocerebellum. Your vestibulocerebellum, like I said, inner ear and eyes. This helps get real-time information into the brain that helps feed our computer, our motion capture system of where we are in space. Our cerebrocerebellum is where we've been in space, how we know to manipulate. Like something that I would use, an example I would use is like a free throw, right? If I close my eyes and take a free throw, I'm not going to, because I don't have that. Like that's a dusty old zip folder in the back of my, parietal lobe, primary motor cortex. But some people, Steph Curry, no look past eyes. What do I need fucking eyes for? I got this system. This system's my backup all day, every which way, and twice on Sunday. Now we get into the spinocerebellum, where this is tapping on those peripheral nerve receptors, right? And they come by 2 major forms, and the mechanoreceptors and proprioreceptors. And this is where I think the conversation gets really interesting, is because when we look at what free nerve endings or what stimuli affect the free nerve endings in mechanoreceptors and proprioreceptors, it's very, very specific. And it's funny to me that in the industry we're in, that people don't actually lean on the underlying mechanisms more, because it's really profound. Like if I were to say recovery modalities in a gym, or like rehab tools, you're probably going to see things that either apply light touch, deep pressure, vibration, or skin stretch. That pretty much just summed up the entirety of what the rehab market pain management looks like. Whether it's compression sleeves, which are giving you a little bit of skin stretch, giving you a little bit of light touch. Those are free nerve endings. Like that's a key, that's a lock that lives in our subcutaneous system, in our skin. Mechanoreceptors live within our skin. That the only key that turns this lock is the presence of something stretching the skin, right? Or in the sense of a deeper pressure receptor, they're obviously a little bit deeper in the skin. So when I go and actually stimulate that, the lock is a little bit further in, and I feel that. What I'm doing is I'm starting to put some of these Lycra suit dots of my peripheral motion capture system, I'm trying to put them back online. Most people who lack or have injuries have an issue in perceiving their internal and external environment, and muscles are sensory organs. Skin is a sensory organ. So we have this spinocerebellar tract that feeds in these 4 specific, and it's not as if they act in isolation, right? They act very much in unison. Everything has a component of stretch to it. Even if I do this, my skin has just stretched, but what if I hurt my shoulder and I can't get my arm overhead? Well, I'm not actually getting some of that feedback. I don't know how to map my shoulder in that position anymore. I don't know where I am, so I can't know where to go. And then the trepidation I'm left with, we experience through mechanical pain or nociception. As we move to the next layer, and the reason I'm stacking these the way I am, I'll explain shortly, is when we get to the proprioceptive layer, which is something that, again, is broadly misunderstood. There are 2 to 3 primary proprioreceptors. And proprioception is something that we try and train through various degrees of success. The 2 that are the most popular, that I think are the most impactful, are the Golgi tendon organ and the muscle spindle. Now, Golgi tendon organ, some people may have heard of if you had some exercise physiology background, and that's like the receptor that tells us the onset and magnitude of stretch in a tendon. Now, the most prolific by sheer volume, by the number of actual receptors in the body, is actually the muscle spindle. And this is where people kind of deviate away, or deviating in your thought process can be difficult. Because when we think of muscles, we think of output organs, right? Things that do stuff. That's what we think of muscles. Muscles are our primary sensory organ. And it's by this utility, or by this mechanism, of a muscle spindle that makes them so. So if we think about a muscle, like a bicep, it's really simple to just think about like the tendon to the two tendons with a belly in between, sort of two heads. And we have contractile units that are called extrafusal muscle fibers. And then we have sensory units, which are interfusal muscle fibers. And those interfusal muscle fibers don't necessarily contract. What an interfusal muscle fiber does is, so if I have my extrafusal muscle fibers like this that are connected from tendon to tendon, in the spaces in between that aren't connected to the tendon, we have sensory receptors are wrapped around. Think of like a finger trap when you were a kid. And it's not until the onset and stretch, or the magnitude of stretch, initiates that
everything's a circular pattern, right?
Exactly. So that's what stimulates a onset or stretch. So like, we talk a little bit on the live about like a single leg RDL. One of the issues you might have is, can I borrow this for a second?
Yeah.
This is cool. So you watch someone do a single leg RDL and you watch their foot kind of like do this, and they're trying to like, oh, my ankles are weak. It's like, well, hold on a second. What if I just did that? Now it's stable. It's not the foot's problem, right? It's not about the tissue tolerance of the foot. It's about the applied force from the hip. So when we're seeing someone trying to like catch their own foot, keep their center of mass over their base of support, what we're seeing is like really rapid onsets of stretch and relaxation reflex that comes from these muscle spindles in between. So what happens is, as we perceive a stretch, like, oh, I'm falling over, I'm falling too much, that stretch then sends a reflexive signal back into the contractile unit, and it's like trying to calibrate. I always think of like any space movie where they just have like those little air blaster things, and it's super like inaccurate. And they're like, I'm trying to land on the thing, and it's like, okay, that's almost what your muscles are doing. But the contraction is starting by the sensory input in, which is fundamentally different than like a normal strengthening exercise where we go, I'm going to do a bicep curl. We have a motor pattern for that. Pre and primary motor cortex goes, I'm going to depolarize this sort of symphony of muscle contraction and do this, right? My wrist has to do something or not do something, my elbow, and then I have to control the rest of my skeleton. So I do that. That muscle contraction started here, right? When I stand on one leg, the muscle contraction that's happening, that's creating this little like interstellar trying to land it over the midfoot, that's starting at the level of the muscle. That's training the sensory component, that muscle spindle. And that system can be polished, and we can train that. Now, when we do that and we polish it, we're lighting little candles all over the body, right? So now we're super efficient. When people don't have this and they're constantly just being dragged to the center of the earth, and they don't have an idea of where they are in space, we don't have those candles everywhere. So what do? Is we turn on the big lights upstairs and we put them on high tone, right? And that's why people get globally tight, is that they can get globally tight or they can get locally tight, and it's all centrally mediated. Right? It's mediated by bringing together these three systems to create an internal motion capture system, right? So athletes will be really good at all three of these. Some people can get away with two, and we have redundancy systems in our body for this all the time, right? Like some people, if you watch them walk and say close their eyes, they're going to start to walk more rigid, right? And it's part of it is like they don't want to run into things, but someone who like, I can wake up and go take a piss in the middle of the night, and I can like Ben Johnson that shit, because I know I've done that trek so many times. It's pitch dark. I can fucking flat out 440 to the bathroom. But why? Because I have that system in our brain. I have that cerebrocerebellar system, that motor pattern in there. So I don't need my eyes. And frankly, I don't even need the inputs. I get them, but that's what makes a really good athlete a really good athlete. You like someone like Bo Jackson or Deion Sanders, commonly cited as the best athletes of all time. Their peripheral sensitivity can allow them to learn these skills so much faster, and their visual acuity will allow them to map their environment in real time. So when we look at tightness, and we look at things that are palliative, right? We zoom in and we go, oh man, this lacrosse ball. it's like that person might even have a visual disturbance. That person might have, and maybe if we put that person in front of a mirror and they could actually see themselves, they could improve their mobility. And I know that to be true. You can see mobility improve with something like as simple as caffeine, right? Because caffeine is just going to start to sharpen a lot of these pathways, right? So you're going to start to see these transmissions, which is happening at the brain, allow for mobility to be improved with a simple supplementation.
What does a mirror do? It's just giving that feedback?
Yeah. It allows you, because if you don't have the proprioception, that's a really good question. If you don't have the proprioception coming from the muscle, but if you can augment it with your primary system, with your visual field, you can start to see, I know where I am, so I know where I need to go. Right. And this is the thing. And it's funny, I anecdotally, as I've been studying this over the last decade and a bit, I got into powerlifting. And I remember the first time I squatted at Boss, I had a 550 squat coming out of a commercial gym. Moved out to California, heard about Boss, trained at the Was Gold's gym down there in Santa Clara, and then went into powerlifting at Boss Barbell. It was the first time I ever squatted without a mirror in my life. I realized I didn't know how to squat. I only knew how to fix my squat, because the muscles didn't have to become sensitive to my position because I was so reliant on that visual field, that vestibulocerebellar system. But now, and as powerlifters, they always do that thing where they turn the other way in commercial gyms and look at all the weak peasants. And it's like, they might not know why they do that, but it will throw them off, especially the better they get, the more sensitive they are, right? The more you would optimize, the less capable you come at adapting. So that, when we talk about tightness, and I'm sorry to shoot up to it, but I really think it's an important concept, and it's a really great question, because it's a centrally mediated process. But when we see things that are palliative, and this is where I want like a takeaway to be, that's great. Like if the foam roller like works, fucking right. Have you tried a Theragun? That's vibration. Have you ever tried like taping it? That's skin stretch. Have you ever thought about wearing sleeves or cuffs or something? Like that's just a little bit of additional skin stretch. All of these things, but have you thought about visualization? Have you thought about watching video of yourself after? Have you thought about doing this for a little bit in front of a mirror, right? Visualization, the cerebrocerebellar patterns, there's a really, it's a study that's often cited, but there's a cohort of basketball players. I don't know if you've ever heard of this research, where the one went out onto the field, or went out of the court, and shot for 2 hours, and they did a 2-week intervention. One went out and visualized, and the other didn't do anything. There was a relatively insignificant difference between those that went out and visualized shooting versus those that didn't. Now, the reason I think that was the case was these were people who already played basketball. They had the proprioception, they had these motor patterns, and they were just polishing them. And I think two things would have happened. One, if you took a non-basketball cohort who didn't have those skills or weren't athletic, you wouldn't see those, right? You'd see a remarkable difference in the people actually going through it. And I think that doesn't get mentioned, and I think it feeds into this model really well. The second thing is, I think if you took the shooting group of the same cohorts, the way they were divided and selected for, and had them shoot for 6 hours, now they're getting fatigued. Now the shot accuracy is worse. They would probably do worse than the visualization group, right? So it's about deploying better tactics and strategies if we understand mechanistically what it is that's actually causing the tightness. So as coaches, it can give us, and it can open up our view, no pun intended, to a lot more strategies, rather than just being like, foam rollers are dumb. It's like, well, they're dumb if you think that they're breaking up scar tissue. But if you understand mechanistically how it affects the peripheral nervous system in this case, and how the peripheral affects the central nervous system, you can be like, well, no, they're not dumb. They're a part of a much larger picture, right? They're one of 9 sensory inputs through a spinal cerebellar tract, which is one of 3 major inputs through the cerebellum, which then has to feed into the rest of the 4 lobes of the cerebrum, midbrain, pons, and medulla, right? So it's like, it's complicated, but it's really worth understanding, even at the very least, of going like, hey, you know what? Maybe more is better, but more variability. Our brain loves variability. It loves new shit. And I think if we can understand very specifically what those underlying mechanisms are, we can just go, oh, okay, let's just apply a little bit of this, a little bit of this, a little bit of this. And it might be outside of the way we conventionally think about it, but that's mechanistically how these things happen. Sorry.
That was awesome. That was amazing.
If you're someone that's taking supplements or vitamins or anything to help move the needle in terms of your health, how do you know you really need them? And the reason why I'm asking you, how do you know, is because many people don't know their levels of their testosterone, their vitamin D, all these other labs like their thyroid, and they're taking these supplements to help them function at peak performance. But that's why we've partnered with Merrick Health for such a long time now, because you can get yourself different lab panels like the Power Project panel, which is a comprehensive set of labs to help you figure out what your different levels are. And when you do figure out what your levels are, you'll be able to work with a patient care coordinator that will give you suggestions as far as nutrition optimization, supplementation, or if you're someone who's a candidate and it's necessary, hormonal optimization to help move you in the right direction so you're not playing guesswork with your body. Also, if you've already gotten your lab work done, but you just want to get a checkup, we also have a checkup panel that's made so that you can check up and make sure that everything is moving in the right direction if you've already gotten comprehensive lab work done. This is something super important that I've done for myself. I've had my mom work with Merrick. We've all worked with Merrick just to make sure that we're all moving in the right direction and we're not playing guesswork with our body. Andrew, how can they get it?
Yes, that's over at merrickhealth.com/powerproject. And at checkout, enter promo code PowerProject to save 10% off any one of these panels or any lab on the entire website. Links in the description as well as the podcast show notes.
I guess, how would something like, you mentioned how other things can kind of play into exactly what you were talking about there, like myofascial release, and maybe it's not actually myofascial release, but it's doing something and somebody rubs something on somewhere and it feels better. So we do like at least have some people noticing that it feels better. Where does something like red light, where does that fall into this scheme of things? Is that more on the mechanotransduction side? Or?
Yeah, I mean, best of my knowledge about red light therapy, that would be more mitochondrial and cellular energy. So to what degree that would bottleneck your ability to move? It could be something as, and I don't know if would red light emit heat? Probably not. I don't think those things get.
It emits some heat, but not a lot.
Not like an infrared or something like that.
Yeah, it's not wild.
Yeah, so I think to what degree, and look, there might be conditions out there that are bottlenecked by that level of specific cellular metabolism, where in that case, and how do you find out? Test and retest. Hey, my mobility is better after I do red light. Amazing. Then what we can infer from that is if red light's mechanism of correction is somewhere at the level of cellular metabolism or ATP production in the mitochondria, or however that science shakes out, then that was an underlying cause, right? If that's a variable that we're testing against and we test against it and it improves, like, and you know what? Maybe the whole fucking hypothesis is wrong, but what are you left with? You're left with someone who feels better and moves better. Great. That's what I'm after. I like trying to be right. And I only know this stuff because I think it allows me to more consistently be correct. But being correct is not about passing a test. Being correct is about getting my athletes to move better. So if they tell me something, especially like high-end athletes, like professional athletes who do this for a living, I'm immediately looking for the mechanism. They are right until I can prove them wrong. And why would I try and do that? Well, like they're so hypersensory that it's like, okay, there's a mechanism here that we don't understand. Right? The caffeine thing. Like I went down that research because someone was like, yeah, I'm way more mobility when I do caffeine. I was like, that's why. I mean, I've never not trained with caffeine. So I'm like, maybe I'm stiff as a board and it's been caffeine this whole time.
There's something like mushrooms, I know, would drastically probably improve someone's mobility.
Yeah, this is not medical advice. I mean, I get pretty limber. I get pretty loose when I'm on a few grams. So but it was literally that. Like when people hear things, I think we're quick when we don't understand mechanisms to discount things rather than like, hey, let's include this, but let's try and figure out mechanistically what is the principle that's driving this adaptation to occur.
Have you seen cold therapy be of benefit to some people?
Yeah, I find that really interesting. So yes. And it's one of these things, like I look at cold tubs almost like I look at Turkish get-ups, where it's like, once you're good at them, you probably don't have to do them, right? Like if you have all of the integrated mobility and coordination to do a Turkish get-up and you're like hip extension then doesn't overload your shoulder upward rotation and all that, because at the end of it, you could be left with this like compounding layer exponential just being in a shitty position. And it's like, well, it might not be that effective. Second, you can do it. It's like, is there much benefit to doing with a 135 barbell? I don't know. If you're Christophin and you're good at it, then fucking rock on, man. But like, I can't do it, so I don't. What I see a lot, and this comes down to almost like, it's a principle that's been kicked around a lot in the strength and conditioning world. Poliquin had a crack at it. I think Thibodeau has spoken about it in the past. But you see a very clear divide when you work with athletes. And I would look at it, and I think historically this has been documented by others who run into this problem where it's like, what are the main neurotransmitters that drive these people? Like you have some people who are like, kind of walk into the room, big game, what's up? And you got kids that are like hype. And, you know, sometimes you need those people to come down. Now, the hype guys, you put them in cold water. Okay, all right, this. And what I think is happening that I don't think gets discussed often, and this is just like a theory, so like don't crucify me for this, but there's this idea called respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is essentially, if we think about breathing is an extension of both autonomic and voluntary, right? It's the core of almost any meditative practice. And what makes it so unique is that our ability to tap into something that's autonomic. Now, we can't, at least I can't, tap into other autonomic pathways, right? Like our norepinephrine, epinephrine pathway, our adrenal pathway of like fight or flight, acute fight or flight. Mm-hmm. I cannot replicate the state consciously of someone walking in here with a revolver. I can't. Ooh. Right? Sorry, is that too real? Davis seems nice. And I feel like
lock the door.
I feel like he's got us though.
Oh yeah.
Right. Okay.
Oh yeah, you'll be fine.
Okay. Yes. Okay. But I can't replicate that, right? Like that's autonomic. But breathing is almost this really unique gateway into the autonomic nervous system. So when we think about our breathing cycles, inhalation and exhalation, they are paired inextricably to inhalation and exhalation. So what I mean by that, autonomic, let's back up. Inhalation and exhalation are paired to parasympathetic and sympathetic. So if you've ever gotten like really good news on something, like, you know, you just got accepted to school, or you know, your thesis has been approved, or your dissertation, you got your beat, whatever. Exhalation, parasympathetic. Homeboy rocks up with a snub nose. Inhalation, sympathetic, right? Now, so we know inhalation to be even, and this is where the study of HRV comes in. So respiratory sinus arrhythmia comes into the study of HRV, is if you have a lack of variability in this, like heart rate variability, you lack these spikes in over time, basically in not necessarily inhalations and exhalations, but what we're really assessing for is the delta, the number of changes that we've made from your highest high to your lowest load when it comes to variability. So when it comes to athletes, is there might be some benefit from recovering from like a neurological perspective to get sympathetically driven people into a more parasympathetic state. But there's some guys that are super chill. So like there's almost like two camps that I see here. Like there's a guy who I never put in the cold tub but throws med balls before the games. But there's a guy who doesn't need to throw med balls in a game. He just springs around. His feet barely touch the ground all day. That guy might get in a cold tub on a recovery day, right? Because he's up when we need to come down, right? Where some people are like, you got a guy, we got some Russian cats in the NHL that like, you know, they're just asleep. But then you put them on the ice and they're killers, right? So you're just like, does that guy need to go to sleep? Do I need to force him into this practice of exhalation-driven parasympathetic nervous system activation? So probably not. I'm probably going to need an acute catecholamine response prior to him actually going out on the ice. I need to bring him up and teach him how to come up more. Where it's like, I got the jackrabbit kid coming in, bouncing off the walls. He's the guy fucking with the music. And he's like, all right, that kid's got to, and you put him in, right? You put homeboy from the old country in there and he's just like, yes, that was Russia. And I was like, oh, he's fine. He doesn't need it, right? So it's a super interesting conversation that I think doesn't get had enough. Like we look at research, it's resurfaced now. We've known this for years. Back when I was a strength coach at Stanford almost 10 years ago, we pulled the cold plunges out of some of our athletic facilities because of the negative effects to hypertrophy. This has been well documented for time. Why it's recirculating on Instagram now, I have no idea. But I think there's undoubted benefits for people that it's beneficial for. I think what people lack is exclusion criteria. And I think the exclusion criteria can be something akin to behavioral. And it's almost like anything. It's like, are you good at it? Yes. Well, you probably are missing an opportunity, or you're paying an opportunity cost for going under this practice where you could be really using that time better leverage in somewhere that might actually improve other aspects of your recovery that you're not paying attention to.
I'm curious about this because we actually were talking to Jesse about it too a little bit yesterday. But There's a side of fitness that's like the functional side of fitness, where they'll look at, I guess, athletes with some lean body mass or athletes that use resistance training. And there's a belief that doing that will actually remove an athlete's athleticism and make them slower, make them not as springy, will take away from their ability to be fascia driven, is what some people call it. Have you heard of this or no?
No, then you've never worked with a real athlete.
You've never worked with a real athlete.
Now, so I'm curious, like, what do you think?
You've never worked with a real athlete.
Okay.
If a fucking puddle can make this guy slow, he's not a real athlete. Are you joking me? The best athletes I know can tie one on and still fucking run a 4.2. Right? Like, it's just, I'm sorry, whatever fucking, equestrian you're doing is not a real athlete. And look, that might be true. So like, and look, there might be application to that. If you have someone who's reverted to the mean of physical ability and they are not an end-tail outlier performance, then that might be true. But what is consistently true at the end tails of high performers, which I would call athletes, and because that's a meaningful conversation, is what do you define as an athlete?
Mm-hmm.
Like, does the soccer dad who does CrossFit 3 times a week that his coach calls an athlete before a WOD, is that guy less springy after a cold tub? I don't know. But does it matter with his 93-pound muscle snatch? No, it doesn't. You're not an athlete. Like, by my definition, and what an athlete can do is can learn motor skills really quickly,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think of this. My sister has 2 kids, and I was in Australia. She lives in Australia. And I was in Australia maybe 6 months after she had her daughter. It was her first child. And I have no real exposure to toddlers. I don't have kids myself. She's the only sibling I have. I don't really have any cousins. It's just me, her, my mom, and my dad. And I remember like, what do I do? And then she was like, do what all parents do. There's an iPad. I was like, brilliant. Look at me go. And I remember watching, I don't know, my sister is like savant level smart, and my brother-in-law is also brilliant. So like, I'm watching this and I'm watching her go through the iPad. I was like, holy shit, this is nuts. Like, this thing's a robot. This is wild. I don't even know. Where was that app? Can you change my settings? Like, it's been a little bright. Can you turn it down? And then I flew back to Tampa Bay in off season. I was working with a running back he was with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at the time, and like freak athlete. And I gave him a drill that was was absolutely complex. And it was complex just because it's like early off season, I'm trying to manage load. I don't need him doing something heavy. I need him thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I gave him an exercise that may have taken, I don't know, a mortal couple months to master. He mastered in 3 reps. And I saw the look on his face, and I remember thinking, like, God, this is just like my niece. And it's like what he's doing is learning motor skills really quickly. If the idea that you're going to drop someone in some Wim Hof shit and they're not going to be there's a difference between clinically and statistically significant differences. So you might be measuring and I don't know what the study is, but if you're measuring some sort of in vivo elastic response to a tendon or some sort of collagen type and trying to equate that to someone who's been doing something for 15 to 20 years at the highest level that has a genetic predisposition to being particularly built for the sport they do, and you think puddle water is going to fuck them up, like, you're not working with real athletes.
Oh, I think that it wasn't that the cold plunge is going to mess with the athletic performance. It's resistance training. So strength training, like training with like doing squats and deadlifts and like like flat-footed training.
So the thing is, well, again, I think the same principle applies if you work with a real athlete. Now, the best athletes in the gym tend to sit next to the coach on the bench. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that good athletes can't move well. Mm-hmm. I think the best athletes have ultimate variability, which means any task, especially as slow and relatively controlled, like I think of ice hockey players, for example, because the sport is so fast.
I want to interject something real quick. A lot of times the guy that sits next to the coach, he barely made the team.
Right.
And he made the team because he's proficient in the weight room. Everyone sees how hard he works. So like, amen for this guy. Let's bring him aboard, and he's jacked, so it's cool.
Yeah.
But he doesn't know how to play.
Yeah, the 6th man has always got like 18-inch arms. Like, all right, let's go put in the goon squad, 4th line guy. We need a bit of muscle on the team. But to say that the training makes them slow, it's like, no, what will probably make you slow is an increase in body weight, but an increase in lean body mass. And this is a study called anthropometry, which gets super, super interesting in sports science. And I think will be at the forefront of sports science in the next decade, is in order to understand volume and intensity and really load in a training program, you actually need to really monitor body weight. Right? Like, you can look at prize horses and how much decreasing their body weight, even marginal amounts to their body weight, I don't know, 1,300 pounds. How big's a fucking Clydesdale, right? you drop a couple pounds off, that's going to be something that links to their performance. So, if you want to have the conversation, and putting on weight, maybe, yeah, for sure. You got more to lug around. You want to go out there with a 20-pound rucksack on. If that 20-pound rucksack is a vest or is it pecs and delts, it's like that might not be effective. So there's definitely a load management issue, but it's not the fact of muscle. I think conditioning the muscle from a motor output perspective leads into our conversation earlier. There's always going to be a sensory input perspective. How unbelievably sensitive he must be under a barbell, right? Like he could tell you if a floor is unlevel. He could tell you if his shoelace is untied. He could probably fucking count the rivets on the knurling of the bar on his back, right? And it doesn't come from him necessarily being in environments where he's training the sensory input. But these two things are linked. Right? Like, in early stages, we had a question in the live about if you're trying to improve someone's stability in something, it's like sometimes the answer is put them on a leg press because the motor output you're getting is actually feeding some afferent, so sensory input into that muscle that's just focused on motor output. They're never closed off. So I just think if you're working with someone who you think weight training is going to make them slow, not that athletes don't think that, and not that it's not important to accommodate your training program to make sure that your athletes psychologically feel a certain way and accommodate the potential underlying physiology to make them better. But that's why it's called coaching and not programming, right? So there has to be a way where you can learn how to, and a lot of the times is getting results. Right? Getting the results you need through implementing the sensory things that they might like that might not be more output driven or more consistent with, what we would look at as conventional weight training, but being able to show them through controlled interventions of specific exercises and going like, look, this is moving the needle in a meaningful way for you. How do you feel? Right? So athletes will proclaim that and that they're not wrong. To proclaim that the underlying physiology is something with a bunch of words, mechanistically, myofascially, whatever, is just, that's a reach that you just can't make. Like you can't substantiate that claim with any sort of principles-based, biomechanics or neurophysiology or neuromuscular physiology. You just can't make that claim. You can state anecdotally that athletes do feel that way. That's fine. I know Broadway singers that don't like to train because it feels like their neck gets tight. It's like, okay, that's fine, dude. Like, yeah, you're hypersensory and we need to understand that. We need to program accordingly. But it's also, we need to understand the long-term benefits of keeping an athlete robust and in the game to collect enough data to continue to be sensitive at the sport that they play.
Where does athleticism, Andrew has a young boy, 2 years old, right?
He's 3 now.
Oh, he's 3. Mm-hmm. God damn.
Time to be flying.
Yeah, Andrew's got a young son. And, I think a lot of people listening probably want to kind of know, like, how do you assist somebody to become athletic? Not like you're trying to make,
he's my way out,
a Division I athlete or anything like that. But where does athleticism come from?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question. I mean,
doesn't it come in our developmental years? Doesn't it come from if you don't have it by the age of X, then you might not ever really be able to catch up with it?
Yeah. So you could look at it. We spoke about skill acquisition earlier, and I think this is an apt analogy as I think you could make. Like if we were trying to, do either of you speak Spanish? You said, yeah? Do you speak another language?
I can barely speak English.
Right. Bless. Right here with you, brother.
Thank you.
And it's just, it's not so much that physical skills have a unique propensity. Obviously, anthropometry, like height and weight and those things, play massive roles in your success as an athlete. Whether it's something more specific like a fiber type, or fiber or twitch fiber bias, fast or slow or something like that, or it's you're 6'11" and both your parents are trees. It's like, all right, what the fuck do you think you're going to play, right? Like, have fun on the basketball court. So, but to think that athleticism trends like any other skill that you learn, it's no different. I think it's just there's a window for that cognitive associative autonomous phase to start, that it starts closing, which can make things a little bit more difficult, but it's nothing unique to athleticism as a skill or set of sub-skills. It's just more unique or more broadly unique to skills itself, right? Like if your son, does he speak Spanish?
He barely speaks English right now. Yeah.
Okay.
So he just communicates with a couple sounds here and there.
Okay. Are you going to teach him Spanish?
I'm going to try to, but again, it's just I don't use it that much myself. So It's just one of those things that he might pick up on a couple words here and there, but yeah, I don't know. We'll see.
Well, if you were to want to teach someone a second language, you would want to do it younger. And that's just, and whether it's piano, whether it's violin, whether it's Mandarin, whether it's, a physical motor skill, these things, the fundamentals, the cognitive phase starts when the brain is developing the most. And if you can lay a foundation of that cognitive, the associative autonomous can come later. So it's really like the musical analogy probably trends best for most people. It's like, I have a little bit of a music background, but if I were to learn the notes as they are represented on a treble or bass clef, right? So like FACE or EADGBE or whatever the hell it is, I would look at that and go, okay, I know this as sort of the corpus of the musical story, right? These are the notes that get played. These are the tones. These are the octaves. These are the sharps and the minors and the flats. If just knowing that alone at a young age where I can start to adhere that to memory, and I started playing piano when I was quite young, so I'm pulling that from the third grade, and I played guitar a little bit here and there, but nothing at a theoretical level. If you can get into the cognitive aspects, which kind of play into what we talked about, which like, can you start putting them in variable positions where they're getting a lot of input? I'll ask you a question, and I'm assuming I'm going to get a very consistent answer. If you were to go into a lab and make a kid with the sole purpose of being a professional athlete, what is the first sport that undoubtedly, if I'm Steve Harvey and this is a Family Feud question, and we go survey says, what is the sport that you are going to put your son and or daughter in to make sure that they have the best chance of becoming an athlete? What's the sport that everyone's going to say?
Gymnastics.
Yeah.
Gymnastics, right? And we all know that. Why? Because it's giving them the cognitive psychomotor skills to be just inherently aware of an ever-changing external environment. And that's really that is a big part of athleticism. It's building that sensory system at a time where they're just able to learn some of these skills. It's very hard to. Now, people get into gymnastics later in life, but most people's equivalent neurologically, as far as complexity goes, of getting into gymnastics later in life is actually just getting into conventional resistance training, right? Where people, and this is I think an interesting moment if you work with people in the physical space. Most people who got into what we do for a living have always been on the leading edge of that cognitive physical development. We've always been eclipsing these milestones. Probably everyone in this room has been, the 99th or 100th percentile, like off the charts in physical ability as a young age. And when it comes to trying to, superimpose your experience, your lived experience as a human athlete on this planet with someone who's not been on that, how many people are willing to open up their wallets in a commercial gym or online for a program or advice for them to start their journey, if you will, into athleticism. And we don't see the gym as athleticism because we've all been in scenarios where the external environment is changing 100 times a second. So our ability to process how relatively minute a change that could occur during a set or a repetition is just so trivial to us. But that's like taking me and being like, all right, Iron Cross. I'd be sitting there like Vince Vaughn and old school trying to I can't fucking joke me. That's insane to me. Or like, all right, high degree of difficulty, triple inverted front flip. Oh, like, dude, I'm going to crack my skull open and break my fucking neck. That is to someone who, was always maybe, as a coach that works with us, Kyle Baxter, I just love this phrase. For people who are weaker than the forces of gravity acting on them, something as simple as a lunge or a hinge. Oh my God, a hinge is like the highest degree of difficulty. Now we look at it and go, I don't really get it. Like just shoot your hips back and like bring your chin away from your tailbone or whatever your cue is. That's like, some Russian gymnastics coach. Like, I don't get this. You just tumble a bunch of times. It's like, dude, I don't fucking know where anything is, dog. It's nuts out here. I'm spinning, I'm throwing up. Like it's crazy. There's an issue with, people who get into the industry always being on that leading edge, that almost unquantifiable edge of their physical and cognitive development. They don't understand the interaction that most of their clients have with gravity. And when you can start to be, the term I use is like physically empathetic. Like, hey, I don't understand, but it must be difficult to be able to navigate. Your exercise selection, the way you look at the gym starts to change, right? So at this point, I forget the initial question, but something to do with building athleticism at a young age. I would just expose them, variability, right? What do you see best with, if you look at some of the best athletes If I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure Patty Mahomes could have gone pro in baseball as well.
I think so. Yeah, he played basketball as well.
Right. And what is building that? It's variability. And now, do you need to be like, well, we're going to do this, we're going to do gymnastics for this much? And that's what gymnastics provides you. It provides you variability or variable exposures through different planes at different velocities, at different intensities, with different level of coordination and rhythm and timing and all of that. But it's, I think it's equivalent. And I like where the conversation is going with like the longevity space as they refer back to this. It's like the importance of play. Play can be very useful as its non-specific novel variability, but at a certain point, Patty's got to play football, right? At a certain point, John Tavares is actually a better lacrosse player, so I've heard, than a hockey player. He's the captain of the Toronto Maple Leafs. At a certain point, John has to pick hockey, right? So specificity does also matter, but when we're talking about young age, like variability is really going to be the key. And that's why gymnastics is a really good catch-all, because it allows for that ultimate variability, right? Like I saw Carlos Alcaraz the other day. He was at an Indian Wells tournament, if I'm not mistaken. He was dribbling a soccer ball. Carlos Alcaraz is the number 1 ranked tennis player in the world.
Yeah.
But you think it helps to know where your feet are? Like this guy was out there like fucking Pele. Like he was just dribbling this thing. I was like, wow. And he grew up in like a small town in Spain. He probably played a lot of European football growing up, and that definitely led. So variability, exposure, frequency, all of these things. And guess what? This is the same thing when it comes to cognitive development and learning, right? Math, music, art, science, everything. That's why people make their kid listen to fucking opera music and shit. It's the variability. Oh, you get to hear everything. It's like, yes, that's what we're here for, to experience all that we can experience. So, without getting too metaphysical on it, that's really what we should be after when we try and introduce athleticism to anyone, really. But it's that window of time where cognitive and physical development are most open to us to be receptive to.
You're probably wondering, why am I wearing these glasses? Well, it's because I'm being bathed in blue light. And blue light isn't necessarily bad. There's blue light in the sun. But if you're in your office, if you're indoors, if you're in front of a screen during the daytime, it's not a great idea to have your eyes being bathed by blue light all day long. That's why EMR Tech, a company that we've partnered with, has blue light daytime glasses and blue light blocking evening glasses. These glasses right here are meant for you to wear during the daytime when you're in front of screens, etc. But if you're outside, take the glasses off and get the natural sunlight. And if you're at home in the evening when sun sets and you need to be in front of the TV or you need to be in front of your computer or on your phone, these glasses are the ones to get. They also have the best red light therapy devices on the market. If you stand in front of any of EMR Tech's red light therapy devices, you will actually feel how much stronger the output of the red light is on those devices versus any of the competitors. They also have some of their smaller red light devices like their Fire Wave, Fire Dragon, and Fire Storm. And then if you want to get some of their bigger panels, they have their Fire Hawk, which is their biggest panel, and the Inferno panel. These are literally the best red light therapy devices on the market. And if you want to save on them, Andrew, how can they do that?
Yes, you got to head over to emrtech.com. That's emr-tech.com. And at checkout, enter promo code PowerProject to save 20% off your entire order. Again, that's emrtech.com, promo code PowerProject. Links in the description as well as the podcast show notes.
Oh, I do want to say though, just so adults don't lose hope. I've seen like adults like get into grappling, or because grappling is very variable, or get into, adult leagues in terms of like pickleball, even though people don't look at that as much of a sport. But I've seen some people get very good at these things, but spending time with it over a long period of time. So it's like, don't think that if you weren't an athlete since you were a kid or playing a sport since you were fucking 5 or 6 years old, that you won't be able to develop a decent level of athleticism if that's what you're trying to do now. Like it's not too late for you to develop a decent level of skill in whatever you're trying to do.
You also might have some amazing traits that you never even expressed before because you didn't do athletics maybe when you were younger.
Yeah. And that's where I think just general physical preparedness, like you talk about traits, like quite literally genes don't express until you've reached a certain threshold of stress. And that's both, psychosomatic and also physical. So it's like, yeah, you could be latently an athlete genetically, and that's a much harder conversation to parse out, but you do see that, right? Now, then it's where I think specificity is going to really rule the roost, or specific variability. As a kid, you can almost get away with infinite novelty because all new experiences are novel. And in this case, they're also specific to what they need, which is something new. But as you get older, it's like, well, you might want to have a little bit more of a concerted effort. But I would look almost less at the science behind resistance training to guide your information around frequency, volume, intensity, and all that, I would look more towards the science behind how is it that I'm going to learn faster, right? Like if I'm 25 years old or older, which I am now, the supplement stacks I'm reaching for are like choline, GABA, glutamate, right? These are things, vinpocetine, like these are things that I'm reaching for because I need supplements to help me learn skills. Now, mind you, I've gone to a decently high level of athleticism in a sport that was like very multimodal, multivariant, and played hockey. And now I'm back to resistance training. But keeping that system sharp so that when I am out on the field with, athletes I train with, and I do need to jump on a box or drop down, I'm not like, oh, goddamn, because these are skills that I need to learn quickly. So I need the brain to be malleable and not turn like to plastic in this case. So, I would consider everything that you do as learning when you're an adult who doesn't have a strong background in this. And I would move all of my efforts towards that. The way I set up my training program, the frequency of it, the intensity, the reps in reserve, the supplementation, the nutrition, all be like, what's going to help me learn better? Because that's what you're doing. You're really learning at that point, and you're trying to offset this window that has since narrowed from when you were a child.
You still might have legs day, but you might do like walking lunges or something that's going to maybe express some more movement than just a squat or leg press maybe.
Yeah, the external environment dictates the internal demand. I think walking lunges for you and I are relatively commonplace and relatively easy, but feeling the world through someone who doesn't have that same relationship with gravity, that's such a good place to start. And then we talked earlier about leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for the nervous system to follow, how people will draw to that and what the benefits they'll take out of expressing gait cycle under resistance with a bit of perturbation with dumbbells in your hand. Like I couldn't think of a better exercise that like is really the precipice of athletic movements before we start getting into like Olympic weightlifting and things like that. But yeah, walking lunges should be an absolute staple in everyone's program, whether advanced or not. But if we look at athletic lunges for us, I want to get bigger legs, bigger glutes, or bigger adductors, or bigger quads. I'm going to load it a little bit different. Like I'm going to, maybe I do it with a barbell because I have less variability in that, that perturbation of the dumbbell in each hand. I don't have to worry about my arms being tired, or maybe I use straps when I use dumbbells because I'm really trying to push muscular challenge. I'm going to set a ton of constraints on the new person to be like, no, we're here to practice the skill. We're here to learn before we load.
Yeah, I think a lot of times in the weight room, people haven't really thought about the weight room being a practice or lifting being a practice. And you're seeing now there's more of a marriage between movement and exercise, movement and lifting. Whereas before it was like there's yoga, Pilates, and then there's like bodybuilding, powerlifting, CrossFit, right? And seems to be separate. Do you think this is do you think this is a good thing? Like some of the knees over toes movement and some of these other things that we're seeing, you think that these will have pretty positive outcomes to get people maybe think outside the box a little differently?
Yeah, I think we're systematically moving towards understanding mechanisms at scale, which is like, it's tough. I mean, most people just want to pick up the iPhone and use it, right? Like it's not everyone that wants to bring up pictures of the brain and try to explain how it is this stuff actually happens. But I think we're way further along. The idea that 10 years ago that I could be on a podcast like this and do like a little neuroanatomy lecture just never happened before. Like no one would give a shit. So I think collectively we're moving towards that. I think one of the things that we need to always keep in mind is looking at things mechanistically and then looking at exclusion criteria. Right? Who is this good for? There are cases where particular popular ethos in training are not applicable, and we really need to be clear when we're coming out with these systems to make sure that if you're going to come up with a system, you need to have exclusion criteria. If you're going to come up with a principle, you allow people to self-select for whatever system, and that's why I think principles are really useful, but they're also complex. So if we look at I think if we can begin to teach people the notes of human movement, we can start to be very, very specific. So like, that's why I think warming up took a lot of flack for like a long time, right? I see Deskbound over there, like K-Star, like really changed the game as far as, but what he did was he's exposed so much variable stimulus to people who just never had anything. They were output, and they wondered why their output wasn't moving. He closed that safety pin for them. He allowed that sensory input to start to drive motor output. But what I think we can do is, where I hope this trends to is, I could walk into any gym at any point in 10 years and go, hey, retract your scapula. And that's taught like 1 + 1. Cause that's like, hey, F sharp. Oh, okay. Okay, cool. Yeah. F sharp. Where that's the note. And now if we follow the skill acquisition process through from cognitive associative to autonomous, the associative is like, I say scapular retraction, and what happens is the shoulder blade moves back. That's the association to the prompt and the action, right? So and that's where I think, that's where I see the most amount of benefit. Now, how do we get that to market? It's not flashy, right? Like, I think, and I don't know Ben well, I actually don't know Ben at all, just through his account. I think if there was a principle to apply, that's not a terrible system, but I think there's some underlying principles where I've had athletes come to me and go like, oh, hey, I saw this knees over toes thing. I was like, no, absolutely not. In your case, you have your too acute post-op ACL, or you're too this, you're too that. And it's like, there's a massive market of people who need to be excluded who actually need to learn how to move with their knees behind their toes, not over, not parallel, actually behind. So it's like, how many systems do we need to make until we extract out the core principles? I don't know, but I think that's where we're headed. So I'm positive with, especially guys like Ben who have really moved the needle in a positive way, that we're moving towards that. Now, will the general public ever understand? I don't know. If I become a senator or president, maybe. I'm not from this country. That'll never happen. But I think that'll be what it takes to learn it like you learn 1 + 1, and that physical competency, that physical awareness. I think that'll be the only way, but we're definitely trending in the right direction.
I want to quickly add in, when it does come to the knees over toe stuff, there's a bunch of regressions, right? So like when a lot of people think about that initially, they think of like a split squat with the knee going deep in front of the toe, right? But there's a lot of regressions before an athlete even gets there that are set up within that. So it's like, yeah, it's something. If you just had a surgery or you're having knee pain, you don't go towards the thing that's going to cause you the most amount of like discomfort and pain. You start with what you can do with your pain-free range of motion. But I want to ask you this, and there's a video I sent Andrew. Since you've worked with so many different athletes, so many professional level athletes, Mark sent me this video recently. I was wondering what kind of trends you may have noticed with like athletes' abilities and their structures. And we'll play this video, and maybe we can put the sound on. Probably have to restart it, but I wonder what you think about this, but also what you've noticed with structures.
So you want to play it now with the sound?
Let's play with the sound.
Got to hit the sound button.
Classic.
Right, if I got $1. Okay.
Can you guys read that?
Part 2 of the Superpower series is continued with wide infrasternal angle individuals. These athletes may not be the most springy, however they are typically very strong and more muscular-based movers. Don't get me wrong, that's not to say they're not good athletes, just utilize different strategies. While there's a time and place to train these athletes to be more gazelle-like, they may not tolerate high volumes of plyometric activity like their narrow ISA counterparts. Also, in opposition to narrows, they'll thrive and oftentimes want to train with traditional high-intensity exercises. Make sure to dose them with these movements in order to continue to maximize their superpowers.
Yeah, what are some of your thoughts surrounding
Yeah, so I have a lot.
just observing like different body types? I guess he's saying like triangle kind of downward, somebody having kind of a V taper versus triangle like upward where their bottom base is a little wider.
Yeah, so talking specifically about the subcostal angle or the infrasternal angle here, it's very mechanical in the way we'd look at it. Like if I were to, for example, like what he's describing is, so a narrow ISA would have the physical properties of this can as it is now. Now, the wide ISA, which he was highlighting in that video, would be something that carried the physical properties of this can if I dented it. So if I dented this can and it was like smushed, if you will, technical term, this can no longer rotates well. We'd agree. If I put this on its side and I would rotate, it doesn't rotate well, which is kind of what he described. What does this can now do well? Yeah, I can probably flex and extend this can really well a lot. So, I think there's something that we need to respect, and it's structure indicates function. It doesn't dictate function. Position dictates function. So if you look, because I could pull up a bunch of athletes that don't have that structure, that do carry with those traits. So like, for an example, you see this in bodybuilding a lot, and sometimes it's at the top performers, they're anomalous. So like if, I'll use a bodybuilding example as it might resonate, but I'll use a few more. Are we familiar with like a vacuum? So a vacuum, the abdominal vacuum thing. So if we think about a conventional bodybuilder and like how they carry the internal pressures of their abdomen and thorax, a conventional bodybuilder has a lot of compression between their shoulder blades. So you could say like their upper part of their back is compressed. and their lower aspect of their anterior is expanded, right? That's like the bodybuilder gut. Now, if you watch, like a classic physique competitor do a vacuum, is this possible? Can you pull stuff up? Can you search a guy named Steve Laureus?
This is Chris Bumstead.
Okay, so leave him on the side for now because I'm going to show you a range of expression and actually what makes Bumstead so unique and actually what makes him who he is in his particular field. And one of many things.
Who was the other name? Sorry.
Steve Laureus. Steve is Steveaureus.
What?
Laureus.
Laureus. Okay.
Laureus. That's what Steve Laureus bodybuilder. Laureus. I think Laureus. Let's see if it helps find us, Steve. Yes. Okay, great. So if you pull up Steve, now I want you to notice where you can the differences in structure. And this is bodybuilding. So this is relatively remedial as, it doesn't require a ton of sensory. Okay, so can you pause that there? Okay, great. Can you toggle back and forth between Chris's video and this? So obviously we're paying attention to the bottom ribs. Those are very narrow, right? So if we can go that over to Bumstead.
We can open it up real quick.
Well, what ends up happening is bodybuilding is by all accounts a very sagittal plane enterprise, which means a lot of just flexing and extending, right? Now, the problem with having what they refer to as a wider infrasternal angle is you're setting a particular advantage for some muscle. So, for example, I have quite a wide infrasternal angle. When I squat and deadlift, my obliques get fucking massive. Like my external obliques here are quite large still, and I don't powerlift actively as much as I did anymore because I have this these ribs that are always kind of up and out, and it's this big barrel rib cage. That's something I would have to be mindful of if I went into competitive bodybuilding. I might, because of the mechanical advantage that my external obliques are at, given my structure, I might opt to not have that part of my skeleton be constantly under load because the muscles will grow accordingly and I'll have a big waist. What makes him the best is he's actually anomalous in the way he should be shaped. If we're thinking about classic physique, can you go back to Steve? The rib cage that rotates better is going to have a more concentric orientation of the obliques, right? So he's going to have this small waist. The thing that Chris has that most people who are built like him have is he has this tremendous ability to work like the smushed can, but not succumb to any of the negative effects of having a big waist. So if we think about what a vacuum is, right? A vacuum is, okay, where does it go? Where does his stomach go? The pressure went into his upper back. So why do people practice their vacuums on the floor? Because when I lay on the floor, gravity pulls the contents of my mediastinum, my chest cavity, and separates the space between my shoulder blades passively. So why people pass it or do it on the floor is because there's a place for that pressure to go. And then when they stand up, they're like, oh, fuck, I have to do this in gravity now. It's really tough. Right? So you see some people progress to holding onto the kitchen sink when they vacuum. Why? Because it allows them to push their shoulder blades away and it gives that place a pressure, or the pressure a place to go.
Kind of push the back out a little
Exactly. Push the back out. So what makes him unique is the fact that, his rib cage is of a structure that allows him to put on a tremendous amount of muscle with sagittal plane movements, which are more loadable, which, through pecs and his delts, and he can just do all of these major bodybuilding exercises. But for some reason, whether it's exercise selection or execution or his breathing mechanics, he doesn't succumb to this larger eccentric oblique hypertrophy, and he has a really small waist and can win. When we talk about structures in sport, I think just looking at ISA is really, it's short-sighted as far as how much anthropometrics matter. And this is some research that's done by Aaron Wellman and Chris McClellan. Aaron Wellman is now the performance director for the New York Giants, and Chris McClellan is the performance director for the Florida Panthers. They've gone so far as to measure the weight of the axial skeleton using this anthropometric measuring system, compare it to how much does the skin weigh, how much does the lean body mass, how much. So when you do a DEXA scan, you'll do a 3 model fractionation, which kind of gives you how your weight distributes through 3. What Chris and Aaron do is they do it through a 5 model fractionation. And part of this process in measuring the skeleton, and what they've found, is that you can actually find structural, almost hard stops of in the NFL, for example, which is where they do the most of the research, is you can see, because it's not just about the rib cage, you start to see what is the actual shape of someone or of the people who are the best in the world at their sport. So like, let's take a cornerback, for example. A cornerback needs to be able to rotate really quickly. Now, it's less about this structure at the rib cage that we're looking at here. Obviously, Steve would be the better at rotating of the two, just based purely off of that factor alone. But it's a little bit to what you were alluding to. A cornerback in the NFL has a shoulder to hip ratio of minimum 1.6, right? Which means like you're dealing with, if you're going like bitrochanteric measurements at the hip joint and you're looking at bioacromial joints at the AC joint and you're going across, if you're going to be, and this is really useful information if you're looking at like scouting, like if I'm looking at combine kids and one kid runs a faster 40, but he doesn't measure up quite literally to the anthropometry or what we see at the highest level constantly year in and year out as a minimum, right? Like the number one safety is going to come out of Alabama this year. We worked with him for his combine prep, and like, you want to talk, I didn't measure him because we didn't have to, because he's going number one anyways. But one of the reasons he does, it's more global than just ISA. So ISA is, it's a biomechanical system that allows you to predict particular biases given someone's structure. Now, you got to be careful because some of the best people don't carry those structures. And so it's like you always have to use performance as your proxy. You can't just rely on you're wide, you're narrow, therefore you're this, you're that. DK Metcalf, right? Are you fucking joking me? Like, what a unit DK Metcalf is. Now, he's probably built, he's 230. He's probably built more like a wide, but he can sprint like a narrow. Now, he sprints a little bit mechanically different, but sprinting a 10-300 meter at 230 is almost unheard of. That's insane, right? He's probably heavier than Bolt, who's 6'6", right? And he's doing it off the tail end of a season, right? So, structure only indicates function. It doesn't dictate function. Can we expose people who can learn fast to better positions? That will dictate function. Yeah, and that should be the goal. Now, it's just another data point in collecting. Yeah, like what the fuck? 4 bags of candy. What an absolute specimen.
What's the difference in when you were looking at this literature? Did you notice anything different in how much a skeleton weighs? Because it can't. I'm just thinking in my head, it can't vary that much, but maybe it does.
Well, it's about muscle to bone ratios, and that's where these guys are so brilliant. I got to shout them out again, Aaron Wellman and Chris McClellan. And if you look at the teams that Aaron Wellman's just gone back to the Giants, and Chris McClellan has taken over the Florida Panthers, who ironically the first year make it to the fucking Cup Finals. Like, their success leaves clues. Like, these guys are next level operators. So shout out to them. One of the things they found, and it's super interesting, I advise anyone to look into their research, is it's about muscle to bone ratio, right? So muscle to bone ratio is where we can actually risk profile people for injury. And the interesting thing that they found was that it's based off of race. So there's different carrying capacities. Smiling already. He goes, "Oh yeah, I know I'm better." Like, fuck you, dude. Like, what is this? What is this? Like,
he's recording on his phone. He's so excited,
bragging over. He goes, "I know this. I was in the study. Unbelievable." So it's like
they studied me.
Yeah.
Might as well just give us a double bicep pose at this.
Watch him say that white guys are better though. Listen,
I'm not going to say. When have I ever said that? This isn't a competition of who can play a ukulele better, like some white guy shit.
oh yeah.
Are you done being the best? Okay, sick.
You're the
fucking guy. Unbelievable. What a humble brag. Okay. All right. So what they found was we're inferior, and that's actually kind of true. No, it's about carrying capacity, right? So football especially has this romanticized, you got to get bigger, you got to get bigger, you got to get bigger. It's not exactly the case for some people. And like, I've dealt with some athletes who their risk profile is so that they need to get bigger to not be hurt, right? I went through a Major League Baseball team this offseason and did some consulting with them kind of peripherally. And I was like, hey, you look at all of your players with the most soft tissue injuries, they are people who are abnormally light or abnormally heavy. And a lot of that, figuring out the abnormalities, at least in this research around football, has to do with a muscle to bone ratio, right? So when you can measure the axial skeleton through this anthropometric screen that they do, which is, using various calipers and measuring tapes and special tools to start to measure shoulder width and hip width at these particular landmarks, what you see is and I don't want to butcher it, but I think this is as close to the real numbers. An ideal playing weight for a Caucasian player would be something to the effect of 4.5 kilograms of muscle per kilogram of bone, right? So if we extrapolate the math out on that, and you need to make sure that you're calculating for muscle and not just lean body mass. So that's where if someone of that ethnicity, if a white dude starts carrying more than that, the likelihood of soft tissue injury is going to go up. And I want to say the next group was Polynesian, and then African American would be the highest. Something like you could be comfortable at, and comfortable meaning relatively safe given the muscle to bone ratio. It's somewhere upwards of 5.2 grams or kilograms of muscle per kilogram of bone. Right, so there does seem to be, you can
basically hang more muscle off of this skeletal frame that's larger.
Yeah, and that's the thing, though. But there's, it's not all Polynesian, Caucasian, and African American frames are the same, right? So you have a lot of guys in the league, wide receivers that are African American that are just playing too heavy. And we see soft tissue injuries like hamstrings or adductors or groin sprains or calf strains. But more seriously, what you'll see is Achilles and ACL. And one of the leading factors, and this is a really interesting concept, I think, for people to help understand when we talk about load management, we need to consider the relatively constant but still variable unit of measure of someone's body weight. And the comparison I make when we think about the accumulation of fatigue, especially through a season like that and a sport like that, is if we take this room, right, and we're trying to calculate the surface area, or let's say we're trying to calculate the volume of the room. Mm-hmm. A lot of times when we calculate the workload in a program, it's volume and intensity. How many dimensions do you need to calculate the overall volume of this room? You need 3, right? You need the length of the wall, the width of the wall, and the height of the ceiling. So when we think about training an athlete, we think about accumulate, we have GPS data or Catapult to see how much they've run, and we have how fast they moved on a tendo unit, or we're looking at force plates, or we're looking at their total tonnage in a week. It's okay, we kind of put all this together, we have kind of intensity and volume. We're trying to figure out overall workload. It's hold on, we're missing a dimension. You have to be considerate of the size of the thing doing the work, right? So it's a lot of people are sitting here trying to calculate the volume of the room, just going how heavy was it? How many did they do? It's you're just looking at the surface area of the floor, right? That's how long is the wall? How wide is the wall? It's that's only 2 dimensions. That can only give you the surface area. So you have to consider the weight of the athlete and how they distribute that weight from skeletal mass to or muscle mass to bone, because that's going to give you the height, and that's going to allow you to actually calculate the volume. Now, this is where the comparison, I think, really draws weight, no pun intended, is if I increase the length of that wall by a foot, the surface area of the floor in this room scales linearly. If I increase the height of the wall by a foot, the volume of the room scales non-linearly. That's how fatigue works in athletes. So the recoverability demands of someone being a pound heavier, that's a non-linear expression of their demands of recoverability in their program. And it's something we don't pay attention to. Jerry Rice always said, you don't have a long career, have a light career. And there was something to that. Now, he didn't know about any of the research. This has only come out recently, but it was an intuitive predisposition to where a lot of people are going to spend time looking at statistics, because that, we can look at things in the gym biomechanically, but if we're not paying attention to the weight of the damn athlete, biggest rock we can turn over. You see it a lot. And if you guys track pro football, there's been some ACL tears and some soft tissue injuries to some really prominent players. And if you watch them, so-and-so looks good this year. It's hey, it looks a little too big, too jacked. And that's a thing that we have to equate for, because every extra pound is a thing that has to be moved while we're training, while we're running, right? While we're on the plane or on the bus or in the hotel. This is something we carry with us. And that allows for, a metaphorical understanding of this extra body weight scaling the recoverability demands non-linearly.
You and your ladies had an awesome night. You got dinner, or you just came back from the gym, and it's time for that fun time. But you look down at your willy and, it's not working the way it should. Where's that blood flow? Well, that's where Joy Mode comes in. And I can read you these ingredients right off the bat, because they're all natural ingredients: L-citrulline, arginine nitrate, panax ginseng root, and vitamin C. The thing about Joy Mode is you just slip this baby into a little bit of water, drink it, and 45 minutes later, when you're getting ready to go to the Pound Town, you will be ready to rock. And you know what I mean by rock. Joy Mode's really awesome because there's a lot of things that people promote as far as sexual wellness tools, but there's a lot of weird ingredients in there. These are all natural ingredients that's going to help your own production of blood flow. Stick it in some water. 60 minutes later, you're going to be able to stick it into something else. Joy Mode's your way to go. Andrew, how can they get it?
Yes, that's over at usejoymode.com/power project. And at checkout, enter promo code power project to save 20% off your entire order. Again, usejoymode.com/power project, promo code power project, links in the description as well as the podcast show notes.
How would an athlete kind of know if they should downsize? Like, how would they feel? Like, if an athlete's feeling good with the amount of muscle they have on their frame, what are the signs? Like, it's just wear and tear, like overall.
Contact Horizon, HORYZEN. Talk to Aaron Wellman and Chris McClellan, and they will come out. They measure teams all over the league. So if you're in the league and you're listening to this, you probably know who these guys are peripherally. So we do the measurements down in Tampa. We have guys that are trained up in measuring the skeleton, putting it into this sort of an algorithm over time where we look at soft tissue injuries. It's just using big data to predict injuries based off of skeletal mass to muscle mass.
You also might know by maybe getting hurt. Maybe you keep having these like lower leg injuries and you're like, man, what is this? And now if you're hearing this for the first time, maybe you're like pretty big in the upper body and you're lugging around some extra weight. I think, what you're saying, I think kind of blows the lid off of a lot of things. What comes to mind is like people talking about like non-functional training, or non-functional movements, which I don't believe there is any non-functional movements for the record. But I think sometimes people think that bodybuilding might be a waste of time sometimes for athletes. And in basically what you're saying is sometimes it could be, because in some cases, some of these guys might be making themselves a little bit too heavy and it might be negatively impacting their sport, their career.
Yeah. I mean, the hypertrophy side, as so far as the scale is concerned, is always going to come down to nutrition. I could train someone like a bodybuilder and leave them in a deficit, and they'd be a better athlete by the pure virtue of being 5 to 10 pounds lighter. And that, we all know that exercise is trivial when it comes to caloric expenditure, right? At least anything resistance training that looks like bodybuilding training in the gym. So I just think it's understanding that body weight is a massive rock. And in some cases, it's probably the trump card when it comes to big rocks as we're talking about athletes. So really, it's like, can you manage nutrition, number one, as a tool of managing body weight? Can you manage the inputs that then are going to dictate the outputs? Because if they're too heavy, then yeah, I mean, if you go through something with a little bit less mechanical tension as a training style with the same nutritional intervention, will someone be likely to grow more with bodybuilder style training? Absolutely. So if you have a control group of, one person does an off season that's, mostly body weight, dynamic, calisthenic, plyometric, things like that don't carry with it the same, stress demand on the muscle tissue itself to require it to grow and adapt and respond by, potentially adding more weight to the scales, then yeah, by that control group, then the non-bodybuilding group might do better. But if you controlled for total deficit and you just had someone train as a bodybuilder, but you also had them at a deficit, depending on how high a risk profile they were, right? Because if they're only a few pounds over, maybe that's not as big a deal. And maybe the more sport specific plyometric calisthenic body weight training might be better. But if someone is, 30 pounds over and the risk profile's through the roof, like if insurance companies got a hold of this info, they wouldn't be getting a fucking, they wouldn't be getting a policy. Then that person probably be better off doing anything to get their body weight down. And so if that's, it's all, I think the intervention changes based off of your proximity to your optimal sort of green loading zone from a muscle mass to skeletal mass ratio. Because I think at the outer periphery, it's about getting your weight down. And it doesn't really matter the metric of how you do it, because what's really going to move the needle is going to be your nutrition.
Do you sometimes train people with this in mind? And do you think like maybe just give them a little bit less sets, maybe give them a little less reps? So the time under tension, it's almost like you're running away from like hypertrophy protocols intentionally, but you can still strengthen them. And then on the flip side of all this, you can have them kind of loosely power lift, maybe in an 80% range, 85% range. So you're not lifting too heavy, but to maybe increase some bone mass.
Yeah, you won't appreciably increase bone mass to really move the ratio in a meaningful way, but I think you stumbled upon something that's super meaningful is if I know if someone is at a higher risk profile and I know the nonlinear expression of recoverability, understanding how that third axis of their body weight as stacked up to the volume intensity of the training program, what the detrimental effect that has to recoverability by both adding more stress, right? Being a 360 pound rather than a 330 pound. That's just more stress to the system. But it is also going to be an understated metabolic deficiency in recoverability if your body mass is too unfavorable, right? Like if you're, if you're overweight, your hormone profile will be so that you have a more difficult time recovering, right? So there's those things to consider as well. So I think, what you touched on there is super important. If I have an athlete that I know to be out of range, I might pull a few sets and reps out of a program within a week because those sets and reps that they were doing, understanding the load of the body that had to do it is probably the equal equivalent stimulus and still works within the range of recoverability that I'm looking for that athlete until I can get them down. So that is a consideration you would make. Is again, but it's as simple as like, well, how does that come down to this person's interaction with gravity, right? So that's like a fundamental principle. And yeah, if I got a guy who's 30, 40 over and he's in a risk profile that's super high, I'm going to adjust the training. Or it's almost like this guy comes in every day and he's like the equivalent of being hung over every day. It's like, yeah, man, like we're going to scale a few back. We're just going to touch this and get out because, you might be in a position where you're compromised. We understand that this acute metabolic environment that happens after, a bout of drinking alcohol, but we don't really respect it when we deal with, less than favorable skeletal mass to muscle mass ratios and less than favorable body compositions as well. And it's not as acutely detrimental, but it's the chronic negating of that as a factor that leads to a cumulative effect that could be a net detriment, just like training someone too hard after they got smashed the night before.
All right. So I have a quick selfish question because I do have like my DEXA stuff. So because it shows how much my skeleton weighs, it shows all that. So how do I figure that calculation out for myself?
That's a behind enemy lines thing. That's a horizon thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So you can't just like do a multiply.
No.
Oh,
no,
shit.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, because what you've done, you have to take a 5 fractionation model. So a 3 fractionation model of a DEXA or a BOD pod, which would be a 2 fractionation model, doesn't give you enough data to parse it out.
Okay.
Yeah, because then it's going to come down to muscle mass to bone ratio. We have to measure how wide your clavicles are versus how wide your hips are versus the depth of your pelvis. And yeah, it's fairly rigorous, but what I love about it is, to me, it's almost like, I think of like a Richard Mille watch, right? These ridiculous $1 million, 45 millimeters, Swiss movement, the whole 9 yards. And at the end of the day, it just tells you the fucking time, right? Like, and most of the guys that I know, and one of my dudes has 3 of them, and he still checks his phone. Like, yo, dog, what time is it? And he's like Porky Pig. He's got 3 RMs on his wrist, and he fucking pulls out his iPhone. But what I love about it is, and this is kind of an auditing tool I have for sports science interventions, like one of my favorite tools that we've come out with in sports science that's used daily is like a catapult or GPS. It's like, what a novel idea, figuring how much these people are actually running. What I love about this, at the end of the day, the data is so simple, right? No matter how many inner workings and how many measurements we take, the applicable measure is like, hey, fat ass, like, you'll bring it down like 10 before next season. Really, like that's where I think to me, it's a consistent sign of good data when the action items are very simple. Because people will hear about the complexity and be like, well, I don't know, like I got to go talk to these guys. It's like, yeah, the body's complicated, and between the 3 of them, two of them, they have 4 PhDs. Like, yeah, go talk to them. But and the action item is so simple, I think a lot of times when we look at sports science specifically, and it's not unique to sports science, but there's this idea of security through obscurity, where it's the interventions are like so obscure. It's like, oh man, this must be like some crazy stuff. It's like, no, the craziest stuff is the simplest stuff. That's why we like RM. That's why we like APs and PATEX. It's like, wow, the movement is so complicated, but at the end of the day, this thing keeps sick time. And that's what we want for athletes. So that's like, when we get into the neuroanatomy shit and the data and looking at spreadsheets and measurements and specificity, and it's like, well, yeah. Because at the end of the day, it's like we just want to win in the column, right? And that's where I really like thrive off of dissecting stuff to that level. Is like, what does it all mean in action? The simpler the action, usually the more complex the underpinning mechanisms are.
Gotcha.
What you do, is it more of an art or a science?
I don't know. That's tough. I think the I've never been asked that question. That's a really good question. More of an art or a science. I think the art comes from paying attention over time. It's pattern recognition. Like if 93% of communication is nonverbal, that the words I learn are only 7% of it, and the rest of the data that I'm learning without consciously knowing I'm learning builds the instinct that allows me to make better decisions faster as a coach. So I think that's where being in a room really helps, and that's where I think you, from an online perspective, most of the time a pro athlete in the off season is going to want to be face to face. Right. And the reason that is because they inherently know that you're communicating and making decisions off of the collection of all of the 93% of the data that they're giving you. They don't know they're giving you, that you don't know you're learning, but that you're reacting to that more than the 7% of what you hear. So I think the art is understanding the science so well that the communication becomes the only thing that matters.
Fuck yeah. You got anything, Andrew?
Yeah, I don't want it to spiral too far out of control, but no, just because we were talking about functional training, and like somebody will like not want to do machines because like, oh, that's gonna get rid of my functional strength or whatever it may be. I'm not seeing it too much often. Maybe it's just because of like my feed's different now, but a lot of people will start looking. They'll go down like the biomechanics route, and they'll start seeing and only doing like optimal training. Right, they won't do a squat because it's not optimal, or they won't do this or that. Do you think there's a detriment in like learning too much about like biomechanics and that side of things?
I think that's where application is always like the great equalizer, right? Like performance is always your proxy. Being right is being big. Being right is being fast. Being right is being strong. Being right is being healthy, right? Like I don't care about these mechanical models if the guy's a fucking, if he's a fucking shem, right? Like I just don't care. That's not right.
Say shem?
Shem, yeah. You have no friends from New York? That's a New York thing. I don't know.
I've heard it before.
Yeah, it's just like, I don't know. You're a putz. You're a fucking shem.
Fucking putz is great. I like that. Okay.
I know. Shout out New York for real. But it's like,
I see what you're saying. Like LeBron James isn't going online and like fighting with people about his feet.
no, and that's the thing. It's like
he can perform like a motherfucker, so he doesn't care.
And it's a classic sign of like hubris. And like I hate to bring up the Dunning-Kruger effect because I find it a little bit overstated. But it's like I just think that when you get into it, there has to be a respect for two things. One, how complex the system we're dealing with actually is, right? And it's, if you want to understand how to use the apps, that's fine, but know your fundamental limitations. If you want to try and work at a level of engineering, then you have to crack the case open and really accept the fact that you're going to have things that exist in your brain paradoxically, and you're going to have to reconcile that. There are thoughts that I believe that I know to be true that have an exact opposition in my own brain with another thought that I believe and know to be true. And that's just part of complex systems. And the body is the most complex system. So I think a lot of people are wanting to be coaches, and it's very easy to like listen to something like this and be like, oh, like you're overcomplicating it. It's like, okay, like use your apps, go play Bejeweled and leave me the fuck alone, man. Like I'm trying to fucking fix shit over here. So it's, yeah. So you need to, one, accept the fact that the body is endlessly complicated. And what we even claim to know as people who crack open the case is maybe 5% of what there is to know. And that's ambitious. And then the other thing you have to respect is the other thing you have to respect is, athletes are sensory monsters. We see them through the lens of motor output, but what we're seeing is that is a transparency put over their sensory perception, and how they perceive the world is different than the way we do. And I think that's really hard if you haven't lived that. And it's very hard. And even on the other side of that, like it's very hard to perceive how someone who's always been weaker than gravity, how they perceive the world. So it's like a little bit of physical empathy, I think, goes a really long way. And it's like when you realize those two things, that we maybe know 5% if you've dedicated almost 2 decades of your life to it. And the other thing is, you don't know what it's like to move as another person. You have no idea what that experience is. You realize that right is probably off the table, right? And the best we can do is better. And what we're looking for is better is, are we stronger? Are we bigger? Are we faster? Right? So I think do people know too much? No, I don't think you can ever know too much. I think you can do too little. And I think that's where, for me, it's like I'm always, as much as I talk, and I talk pretty much for a living, I've done 100 orders of magnitude more in real life. And that's why it makes talking about it easier, because these are things that I've done in real time with people in real life. So I think, yeah, there's no such thing as overthinking. There's just underdoing.
You have courses and stuff like that. How can people learn from you?
Yeah. So Prescript is my education company. I started almost a decade ago. So applied biomechanics, functional anatomy, www.pre-script.com. I recommend most people start with the level 1 course, but you can book a call to talk to one of our academic advisors to see where our course curriculum best fits where you're at and where you need to go.
Where can people find you?
Instagram at @the_muscle_doc. That's, I don't know. We're on YouTube as well. Podcast RX Radio. I think it's under my account at the YouTubes. Again, I can't say interwebs and YouTubes normally because of you. So
I watch too much of my stuff.
Oh man, it's been a ride. It's been a while. I think I met you at the Cage back in 2017.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
the Animal Cage.
Yeah, Animal Cage. Yeah, that was, so it's been that long, however long that is.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time. I think this is one of the more informative podcasts that we ever have.
Wow, that's crazy. That's saying something. Thank you.
Yeah, it was unbelievable. I think one of the most profound things you said is the body doesn't have to make any sense.
Yeah.
And that's where we'll leave it for today. We'll have you back on the show and talk a lot more about that. But I'll be thinking about that one for a while, because you think that the body has to be this particular way for this person to function this particular way and to be able to do this particular thing. And we're proven wrong time and time and time again.
Yeah, we don't know anything.
Strength is never weakness. Weakness is never strength. Catch you guys later. Bye.
Oh, hello there. You made it to the end of the video, which means that you'll like this video. It's another deep dive. I'm pretty sure you're going to like it. And, well, at this point, you're probably still here because you just want to hear what I'm going to tell you about this video, right? Well,
Say something.
no.